We are going to continue with our study on the book of Daniel. I have copies of this workbook that I'm going to be using as a guide up here. And if anybody wants one, you can have one. If you don't get one, that means you didn't run up here fast enough. Now, if you didn't get one, let me know and I can get some more. I just got them tonight, so I wasn't able to use it for tonight's lesson. I'll leave them up here. So after class and before you go home, if you want to grab one, feel free to. All right, we are in Daniel. And tonight we're going to start with chapter 1. Kind of. We hit some of chapter 1 last week. But we're going to talk a little bit more about it. Okay. There's one thing that I do want to talk about first, and we hit on it a little bit last week. Who's in control here? Okay, God's always in control. There's 3 verses in Daniel chapter 1, and I skimmed through farther on and didn't see this type of phrase, but there's 3 verses that really point to that it's God allowed this to happen, or God, I won't say necessarily made it happen, but He is responsible. The first verse is chapter 2 of Daniel 1, when it talks about, in verse 1 it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, unto his hand. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't necessarily have done it without God allowing that to happen. The next verse, and I have underlined that phrase, and the Lord gave. The next verse is verse 9 of chapter 1. It says, and God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. Because of God that Daniel had favor with them. And the last verse in chapter 1, and again, when I get farther into Daniel, I may see that again. But it's verse 17. It says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature. So, Daniel is making it very clear throughout those 3 verses and throughout that chapter that God is the one that's in control. Something that many struggle with as far as they think they have control of everything. And we have control of the decisions that we make, but ultimately God has control of our lives and of our soul. So I just wanted to point that out. Something that, one of the commentators did mention that, Daniel makes it clear that God is in control, but he doesn't list the other 2 verses that we looked at. Okay, starting back at verse 1, let's read the first 7 verses. Who will read that for me? Bo?
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. He brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. And the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs,
Thank you, Bo. Okay, so we just talked about that the Lord gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. Was it just Jehoiakim that was at fault for this? I mean, we talked last week where it said Jehoiakim did evil in the sight of the Lord, but it wasn't just him. I mean, it was many, the majority, I would say, of the children of Israel that had followed in his footsteps, his rule. So it was because of that God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take over and take them into captivity. I'm going to skip verses 3 and 4. We talked about that last week, about how they chose young men who were good looking, without blemish. I want to go ahead and look at verse 5. It says, "And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of the time they might serve before the king." So, does anybody else have a different word for delicacies? Pardon? Meat. Anybody else? Of course, the New King James says delicacies. The New American Standard said choice food. I mean, I think it's important to notice this. Why do you think they were given, these select people were given a choice? And what do you think that this? I don't mean by like specific foods, but what do you think the king's delicacies were?
Probably very tasty, and maybe they were not as healthy.
Okay.
Meats, maybe meats that were unclean to the Jews.
Yeah. What do you think the reasoning behind it was? And I mean, there's no wrong answer for me right here, because I don't know I don't see anything that tells, well, this is the reason that they were fed these things. James?
I sort of think that tried to give them the choice meat. They're already wise in a lot of different ways that it helps develop our brains and brain power more and things like that. Because he was trying to convert them to be Chaldeans, gave them things, so
Right.
they could be smart people in his kingdom.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
And later you see that Nebuchadnezzar believed in other gods, and usually they sacrificed whatever they had.
Right.
So I would think it's meat, because usually that's the sacrifices,
Right.
which is part of the defilement that I think Daniel didn't like.
Right. And we'll get to that. Frank?
All of it is an assimilation effort. When you ask why are they doing this,
Right.
I mean, if you look at it, feed them our food, give them our wine, teach them our language, so that they may serve in our court. Back in that time, one of the ways you took over another group of people is you took over a group of people.
You forced them to live the lifestyle that you wanted them to.
And that's one of the things that made Daniel's refusing of food so odd to them, is that he fought off the assimilation into the covenant.
Right. Right. Now it says that they were appointed provisions of the king's delicacies. One of the things that I read said that it was the same things that the king ate was given them to eat. The other thing I read is that it may not have been exactly, but it was definitely better than what the majority of them was eating. Yes, Tommy?
That was one of the main reasons, was they were in the king's palace, but when they looked out and saw what the other people, how they were treated, it made it more appealing for them to do a good job, to keep their job.
Yeah. No, I think there could be a whole host of reasons as to why it was done, and I mean, why the majority of them just fell in line. Roger?
Well, I think part of it also was going to be, I think Alan kind of, I think he said that, this is not probably the most healthy food there is, but it would make them look filled out, not skinny, somebody that would be appealing, to the eye, basically.
Right.
Because he wants people that are going to either represent him or be in his presence that are a particular style.
Right.
And of course, they're going to be assimilated.
Right.
Because whenever Daniel does what he does, he comes out fair.
Right.
It backfires on the king for that part.
Right.
But that's what the intent was to get him, I think, to that point.
Right. Well, it's like we talked last week. They didn't want men that were scrawny, weak. So you can't just let them fend for themselves because there might not be nothing for them to eat. So you're giving them what you want to I won't say bulk them up, but to fatten them up, basically.
Well, to refuse the king's food could cost them their lives. It's not like today. They don't have the right.
Right.
The king says, so you're refusing my food? To hell.
Could, yeah. Or say if you're not going to do this, then you're not going to be part of my court. So,
They were slaves. They had no rights.
right, right. Okay. Like I said, regardless, whether it was off the menu of the king or, maybe second of what the king had, it was still better than most. And the majority of them partook. The last part of verse 5 says 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Has anybody that has studied Daniel found anything that tells the significance of 3 years? I I didn't. Alan?
I've heard it described as equivalent of a bachelor's degree in Chaldean.
I didn't think about that, but
And, all the different things, it would have been probably a mixture of both their polytheism, their idolatry, but also mathematics. They were a pretty advanced society.
right.
Science, literature, it's probably a broad and business, and they're going to be serving in the king's court.
Right. So many things. If you think about it, and I didn't find anything that gave a significance of why it was 3 years and not 2 or 4 or whatever. But if you got to think about it, they had a whole lot. Like Alan said, there's a whole lot of information that these men had to learn in order to be able to serve in the king's court. Think about if we up and somebody moved to Japan or got taken hostage, or and they said you've got to learn this. I would want as much time as I could get to learn their culture, their language. Everything about them, so that you could survive. They probably had to learn the history. So I think it was it was just basically the king being kind enough he liked the young men that he had there, and he wanted to give them ample time to learn it. Okay. Any comments or questions thus far before we?
It's sort of think that they might want to eat that food. They've been under siege for a while. Sometimes those sieges last for 2 or 3 years while they run out of food and give up.
Yeah.
So, they might have been poorly in shape that way, but he still was going to let God's will be in him.
Right. Right.
Follow himself.
Okay, let's read. I'm skipping verses 6 and verse 7 because we went through that last week with the names, what they meant, and what they were changed to. So we're going to skip into the next section, which is verses 8 through 16. Who wants to read that? Mike, will you read that for me?
But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel.
It's hard for me not to want to fit in, and we've all been there. We've all been young and had the pressures of fitting in and going along with what's going on. But what's harder than being in captivity, being basically a slave, and having somebody say, here's what you're going to do, here's what you're going to eat, and standing up and saying, no, I'm not going to. Like I said, it's something it's a great example for all of us, because peer pressure doesn't stop once you turn 21. It continues on. Throughout your whole life. So when I say, I'm still young, but you still get pressured into doing things.
Well, what's remarkable, of course, it takes a great amount of faith, which Daniel had, but it still, at the same time, is remarkable. Here's a young kid in his late teens, more than likely. He's been uprooted. He's now in captivity. He's around people that they are probably not the nicest people on the face of the earth. And here he is standing up for his faith to someone who could have the right to kill him.
Right.
And it just shows how much love and respect he had for God, to where he was willing to put his neck on the line and not defile himself.
Right. No, I agree. Something that we all should strive to have that. Be able to face adversity like that and hold fast to our faith. It says Daniel purposed in his heart. Is there? I didn't look. Is there another word in any other version? What's?
New American says made up his mind.
Okay. Well, that kind of answers the question what purpose means. He made up his mind to commit his life to God and be faithful to God, and that he wouldn't defile himself. What's defile mean? To make unclean, to corrupt. So Daniel had decided, and it wasn't just at that moment, was it? Daniel didn't say, okay, right now I'm going to... he already had this. We'll read later on about what kind of life Daniel led even before captivity. So, yes, sir.
In Jeremiah 27 and 28, God tells the king at that time, you serve the king of Babylon. Now what God's telling you is you submit to him. What Daniel's doing here is he's in submission to the king, but there are some things that God has told him, these will make you unclean, these will not be good for you.
Right.
So I don't think Daniel's in rebellion to the king, but he is showing him a better thing.
Right.
My faith is that these are not good for me.
Right.
They will be better for me, and we can prove it to you. We'll try.
Right.
And if they don't work, maybe we'll do what you want.
Right.
But this is one aspect of things. They have to serve.
Right. We've kind of hit on this a little bit, and there's three things that I want to talk about in verse 8, and that's probably as far as we're going to get tonight. Y'all are surprised I didn't make it farther, I know. But there's three options. Well, actually, there were 7 in the commentary that I was using. 3 of them I want to talk about as to why he didn't eat of what the king, the king's portion. The first one, and I'm reading, this is straight from the commentary, says the food and drink of the palace would be likely to have come from the pagan temples and thus to have been offered as sacrifices to the various deities or the various gods of Babylon. Somebody get Exodus 34, verse 15. Who will get that? Roger, will you get Exodus 34? Stephen, will you get 1 Corinthians 10, verses 18 through 21? Dino, can you get Revelations 2, verses 14 and verse 20? Revelations 2, verses 14 and verse 20. Okay. Roger, Exodus 34.
Otherwise you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would play the harlot with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice.
Okay. So did Daniel know for sure that the meat had been sacrificed to a god?
Didn't know for sure.
No. I mean, it would be a very good, guess on his part to say that it had. But I mean, he didn't know for sure. Well, Exodus 34:15, I mean, is basically saying, don't eat of it because basically you don't know. So it's best to abstain from it. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Stephen, you read that. 18 through 21. Okay, so what he's saying is you can't have it both ways. And if you partake of the sacrifice or of the meat of a sacrifice to a pagan god, what are you doing? I mean, are you not accepting what has been done? Can you relate that to partaking of the Lord's Supper? Well, not idol worship and the Lord's Supper, but when you partake of the Lord's Supper, what are you doing?
Well, we're understanding that it was a sacrifice.
Right.
And we are to partake of that sacrifice in a spiritual way, not in a physical way.
Right.
But these were physical things as well as spiritual things back then.
Right. But I mean, we're agreeing with what Christ's done for us. We're accepting that, and that's what I mean by that. If we eat the meat of a sacrifice to a pagan god, are we not saying we accept this worship? This is right. This is true. I mean, and maybe I'm off. And somebody is. If I am, tell me. But that's kind of how I look at it a little bit. Do you know Revelations chapter 2, verses 14 and then verse 20?
14:20. But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there condemned that whole doctrine of Balaam, who has taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. Chapter 1, verse 20. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants, and to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols.
Okay. So here, both verses, Christ is the message in verse 14 to Pergamos. Verse 20 is to Thyatira. And in both verses, Christ says something about eating things that are sacrificed to idols. I mean, at the beginning of the verse, he says, I have a few things against you. Well, that's pretty good indication that we don't need to be eating those things that are sacrificed to idols. Any comments? Okay. The second one, it says the palace would not have observed laws in the Torah about which animals could be eaten and how they were to be killed. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 12. No, I'll take it back. Go to Leviticus first. Leviticus verse 11. Chapter 11. Well, I'm killing it tonight, aren't I? Leviticus chapter 11. And we're not going to read all of this, but I'm going to read the first 8 verses. It says, Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud or those that have cloven hooves. The camel, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The rock, hyrax, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The hare, because it chews the cud but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. So, and then you can go on through chapter 11 of the living things in the water, the birds of the air, the winged insects, creeping things. There were certain animals that the Jews were allowed to eat, and there's ones that didn't. Daniel didn't know. I mean, I think Daniel was just playing it safe by not eating the meat, drinking the wine that was offered to him. But Daniel didn't know if it was, swine or a camel or, or whatever. Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 23 through 25. Only be sure that you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life. You may not eat the life with the meat. You shall not eat it. You shall not pour it on the earth like water. You shall not eat it, that it may go well with you and your children after you when you do what is right in the sight of the Lord. So again, Daniel didn't know. Did they kill it properly? Regardless of whether it was a clean animal or not. And the third thing that it says is meat and wine was considered festival food, and abstaining from it was considered a sign of mourning or penitence, and would be appropriate during the period of exile from the sacred homeland. All three of these make sense. I think they could all be valid. Look at Daniel chapter 10. Daniel 10 verses 2 and 3. It says, In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant food, no meat or wine came into my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all till 3 weeks were fulfilled. So he was in mourning at this point. I would think I would be mourning if I had just been taken into exile. Mourning would be one of the many emotions that I think I would have. Fear would be another. Isaiah chapter 22. Verses 12 and 13. It says, In that day the Lord God of hosts called for weeping and for mourning, for baldness and for girding with sackcloth. But instead, joy and gladness, slaying oxen and killing sheep, eating meat and drinking wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. So instead of mourning, what were they doing? They were celebrating. So I think Daniel here, and like I said, there were 7 that the commentator had. And if anybody wants to look at what the other 4 were, I'll be glad to show them to you. But these 3, to me, make a lot of sense. That this could have been the reason why he refused the king's portion. 22, verses 12 and 13. Any comments so far? Questions? Okay, the last part of verse 8, after Daniel refused, basically, to eat the king's delicacies, it says, therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill or kindness of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your face looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. I think it's it's obvious that the eunuch knows what the purpose behind them eating the king's food. He knows it's going to fatten them up. But I also think it's ironic that he's not necessarily worried about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Who's he worried about? He's worried about himself. He's because it says, then you would endanger my head before the king. So that's pretty clear right there that if these men did not fatten up, bulk up, however you want to put it, the chief of the eunuchs stood to die because of it. I wouldn't want to be that eunuch for many reasons, but for that one especially. Because you see people all the time, they eat whatever they want, whenever they want, and nothing ever happens to them. They stay, the same size. I'd hate to be, him and have one of those in my group. So, any questions or comments through verse 9? All right, next week we'll try to finish chapter 1 and go into chapter 2. But I'm not going to make any promises. So thank you all very much. Again, if you want a book, they're right here. And if they run out and somebody needs one, wants one, let me know. Thank you all very much.